Ryan Mitchell had learned to live with silence. The silence of a phone line that never rang. The silence of a career that had collapsed before it began. The silence of a city, asleep while he sat alone in a radio booth that smelled of burnt coffee and failure. But at 2:47 a.m., that silence broke. The red light on the console blinked, and Ryan answered out of habit. Late night conversations. You're on the air. What came next was not a prank call, not the drunk mumble of a lost insomniac. It was a voice that dragged itself through the speakers like broken glass over concrete, low, guttural, and intimate, in a way no stranger should be. I know where you sleep, Ryan. At first he thought it was a cruel joke, but then the caller began listing details, his trembling hands during a surgery that almost killed a patient, his mother's medical bills piling higher than hope, the night he cried alone in his car after giving up on medicine. Things no one could have known. And then came the words that turned the booth ice cold. I've been waiting for you to answer. That was the night Ryan realized his failures hadn't been buried with the past. They had been feeding something alive, something that had finally found a way into his world through the ringing of a late-night phone. When the voice on the other end of the line whispered, I know where you sleep, Ryan Mitchell thought it was just another prank call. He had no idea that answering that phone would unleash something that had been waiting in the darkness, something that fed on failure and desperation. Ryan stared at the glowing numbers on the studio clock. 2:47 a.m. Another sleepless night in Austin, broadcasting to an audience that probably didn't exist. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cramped radio booth at KAUT 101.7. Empty coffee cups lined his desk, remnants of another shift spent talking to the void. That was Midnight Train to Georgia by Gladys Knight, and you're listening to Late Night Conversations with me, Ryan Mitchell, he said into the microphone, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm that masked years of disappointment. It's coming up on 3 a.m. here in Austin, and if you're out there listening, you're probably like me. Can't sleep, got nowhere else to be. The phone lines remained silent. They always did. But the most shocking thing was, Ryan had once dreamed of saving lives, not filling empty airwaves with his voice. The stethoscope gathering dust in his apartment drawer served as a constant reminder of what he'd lost. Medical school had been brutal, 4 years of sleepless nights, cadaver labs that haunted his dreams, and the constant fear that he wasn't smart enough, wasn't strong enough for what lay ahead. He remembered the exact moment it all fell apart. 3rd year, surgical rotation, St. David's Medical Center. Mrs. Patterson, 67 years old, routine gallbladder surgery. Ryan had been assisting, his hands steady, until the moment Dr. Henderson asked him to make the initial incision. The scalpel had trembled in his grip like a leaf in a hurricane. Mrs. Patterson had lived, but barely. The near miss had shattered Ryan's confidence completely. Medicine isn't for everyone, Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Henderson had said afterward. Perhaps you should consider other options. Other options. The words had echoed in Ryan's mind for months as he watched his classmates graduate, get matched to residencies, begin the careers he'd dreamed of since childhood. His parents had invested everything, their savings, their hope, their pride, in their son becoming a doctor. When he'd finally confessed his failure to them, the disappointment in their eyes had been worse than any physical pain. Taking calls tonight if anyone's out there, Ryan continued, glancing at the silent phone bank. Sometimes we all need someone to talk to at 3 a.m., right? The request line lit up. Ryan's heart jumped. It had been weeks since anyone called during his show. He grabbed the phone eagerly. Late night conversations, you're on the air. Silence stretched across the line, broken only by what sounded like breathing, deep, labored, wrong somehow. Hello? Ryan tried again. This is KAUT, you're live. When the voice finally came, it was unlike anything Ryan had ever heard. Low, guttural, as if someone was speaking through gravel and broken glass. Ryan. The way it said his name made his skin crawl. Not the casual familiarity of a regular listener, but something possessive, intimate in all the wrong ways. Yeah, that's me. What's your name, caller? A sound that might have been laughter echoed through the speakers, wet, choking, inhuman. I've been watching you, Ryan Mitchell. Watching you fail. Again and again. Ryan's finger hovered over the disconnect button. This had to be a prank. Someone from his past, maybe. Medical school classmates who knew about his failures. Look, if this is some kind of joke. No joke, the voice interrupted. Your mother's medical bills. $73,000 and climbing. You work here because you couldn't save her. Couldn't save anyone. The words hit like physical blows. Ryan's mother had been fighting cancer for 2 years. The treatments, the specialists, the experimental drugs not covered by insurance. It had consumed everything. It's why he couldn't quit this dead-end job, why he broadcast to empty air night after night. How do you know that? Ryan whispered. That's when everything changed. The voice began to describe things, private things. The night Ryan had cried in his car after failing his surgical rotation. The moment he'd thrown his acceptance letter to residency in the trash. The conversation with his mother when she'd said she understood, but he'd seen the disappointment in her eyes. I know your shame, Ryan. I feed on it. I've been waiting so long for you to answer. Ryan slammed the disconnect button, his hands shaking. The line went dead, but the studio felt different now, colder, as if something had crept in with that voice. He spent the remaining 3 hours of his shift playing music and avoiding the phones. Every shadow seemed to move independently. Every sound made him jump. By the time his replacement, Amanda Torres, arrived at 6 a.m., Ryan looked like he hadn't slept in days. Rough night? Amanda asked, settling into the afternoon DJ booth. Weird caller, Ryan muttered, gathering his things. Really weird. But there was something he didn't know yet. The caller wasn't finished with him. 2 nights later, Ryan was back in the booth. He'd almost convinced himself the call had been an elaborate prank. Maybe someone who'd researched his background. But as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., anxiety crept up his spine like ice water. The phone rang at exactly 2:47 a.m. Don't answer it, Ryan said aloud to the empty studio. But his hand reached for the phone anyway. Something compelled him, some sick curiosity about what the voice would say next. Late night conversations. Did you miss me, Ryan? The same voice, but worse now. More confident, more present, as if it was sitting right beside him in the booth. What do you want? Ryan asked, his voice barely steady. To play, the voice said, and that wet laughter filled the studio again. You humans are so fun when you're afraid, when you're broken. This time, Ryan didn't hesitate. He hit the disconnect button hard enough to hurt his finger. The line stayed connected. That's rude, Ryan. I'm not finished talking. Ryan stabbed the button again and again. Nothing happened. The voice continued, seeming to enjoy his panic. Your mother called you yesterday. Told you the treatments aren't working. Told you she's scared. But you couldn't comfort her, could you? Because you're just a failed doctor playing DJ in the middle of the night. Stop, Ryan whispered. She's going to die, Ryan. And you'll have failed her too, just like you failed everyone else. What you've seen so far is nothing. The voice began to laugh, and the sound filled the studio from every direction. Not just the phone, but from the walls themselves, from the equipment, from the air around him. It was a sound like bones breaking, like children crying, like hope dying. Ryan ripped the phone cord from the wall. The laughter continued, growing louder, more cruel. Mrs. Patterson could have died because of your trembling hands, the voice taunted. All those patients you'll never save because you were too weak, too scared, too pathetic to finish what you started. He ran to the main power switch and killed everything: lights, equipment, ventilation. The studio plunged into darkness and silence. For a moment, blessed quiet. Then, in the darkness, something cold and wet touched the back of his neck. The voice whispered directly into his ear, so close he could feel breath that smelled like antiseptic and decay. I don't need your machines, Ryan. I live in your memories now. In every failure you try to forget. The darkness seemed to shift around him, and suddenly, Ryan was back in that surgical suite, scalpel in hand, Mrs. Patterson on the table. But this time, when his hand shook, the blade slipped. Blood spurted across his scrubs. The patient flatlined. No, Ryan gasped, squeezing his eyes shut. That's not what happened. But it's what should have happened, the voice purred. What will happen over and over in your dreams. Every night until you join the patients you failed to save. Ryan bolted from the studio, leaving everything behind. He drove home through empty Austin streets, checking his mirrors constantly, convinced something was following him. In his apartment, he double-locked the door and pushed furniture against it. But when sleep finally came, the voice was waiting in his dreams. The next morning, Ryan called in sick. And the next day. By the third day, his manager, Mr. Hoffman, was pounding on his door. Mitchell, open up! You can't just disappear. Ryan opened the door a crack, keeping the security chain engaged. Hoffman looked annoyed but concerned. I can't go back there, Ryan said. Something's wrong with that studio. What kind of wrong? Equipment malfunction? We can fix. Not equipment, something else, Hoffman sighed. Look, kid, I know this job isn't your dream career. I know about your mother, about the medical school thing. But you've got bills to pay, and she's got treatments to cover. You think you can afford to lose this job? The truth hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. He couldn't afford to quit. His mother's oncologist had called that morning. Another round of treatment, another $20,000. Insurance would cover some, but not enough. Never enough. You won't believe this, but Ryan found himself back in the studio that night. His hands shook as he set up for the show, every shadow making him jump. Amanda had left a note. Hope you're feeling better. BTW, all your equipment was fine when I used the booth yesterday. Whatever went wrong fixed itself. Ryan stared at the phone bank. All the lines were properly connected, as if they'd never been touched. At 11 p.m., he went live. Good evening, Austin. You're listening to Late Night Conversations. I'm Ryan Mitchell, and if you're out there in the darkness, you're not alone. The words felt hollow, but he had to try. For his mother, for the bills, for the life he was barely hanging on to. Midnight came and went. Then 1 a.m., 2 a.m. The phones stayed silent, and Ryan began to hope the caller had moved on, found some other victim to torment. At 2:47 a.m., the phone rang. Ryan's blood turned to ice. He stared at the blinking light, knowing exactly who it was, knowing he had two choices, answer or run. And if he ran, he'd lose everything, his job, his income, his mother's treatments. With a trembling hand, he answered. You came back, the voice purred. I knew you would. You can't escape what you are, Ryan. A failure, a disappointment. This time, Ryan found his voice. What are you? I'm everything you fear about yourself, everything you try to hide. I'm the voice that tells you you're not good enough, not smart enough, not strong enough. And now I'm here to prove it. Wait a minute. Don't miss this detail. As the voice spoke, the temperature in the studio began to drop. Ryan's breath became visible in the air, and frost began forming on the windows. But more terrifying than the cold was what he saw in the reflection of the control room glass. A shape was materializing behind him. Dark smoke swirled and condensed, forming into something that defied description. It had no legs, floating inches above the floor like a nightmare made manifest. Its arms were grotesquely oversized, hanging like twisted branches that ended in fingers too long, too sharp, too real. Its head was elongated and thin, far too large for any human neck, swaying slightly as if it couldn't quite support its own weight. And its eyes, two pinpricks of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the sounds that made Ryan's sanity crack at the edges. The entity dripped, not water, but something thick and dark that sizzled when it hit the floor. It breathed with a wet, rattling sound like lungs filled with blood. And when it moved, its form shifted and writhed, as if composed of screaming faces trying to escape from within. "Look at me, Ryan," the voice commanded, no longer coming through the phone, but from the creature itself, from a mouth that was sometimes there and sometimes just a gaping void. "Look at what failure creates. Look at what you become." The temperature in the studio had dropped so low that Ryan's breath came out in thick clouds. Frost covered every surface, and the windows began to crack from the sudden cold. The entity's presence was so wrong, so fundamentally opposed to life itself, that the very air seemed to recoil from it. Ryan spun around in his chair, and the creature was there, inches from his face. The smoke that formed its body shifted constantly, never quite solid, never quite gone. It smelled like burning medical textbooks and broken dreams. "I am every patient you couldn't save," it whispered. "Every diagnosis you missed, every life that slipped through your incompetent fingers. And now I'm going to show you what real failure looks like." The entity reached out with one of its massive, smoky arms. Where it touched Ryan's shoulder, agony shot through his body. Not physical pain, but something worse. The pain of every mistake he'd ever made, every person he'd let down, every dream he'd abandoned. Ryan screamed. "You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet." As his scream echoed through the studio, something impossible happened. The soundproofed walls seemed to dissolve, and his voice carried out into the Austin night, reaching people he'd never imagined were listening. In apartments and houses across the city, insomniacs and night shift workers heard the terror in his voice, but they also heard something else, recognition of their own fears, their own failures, their own 3 a.m. demons. And they began to call. The phone lines at KAUT 101.7 lit up like a Christmas tree, but the creature's presence meant none of them could get through. The entity fed on Ryan's despair, growing more solid, more present with each wave of failure. It forced him to relive. "Your mother will die knowing her son gave up," it hissed, "just like all the patients who died because you weren't good enough to save them." Ryan collapsed in his chair, the weight of every failure crushing down on him. This was it, the end of everything. The creature had won. When the phone rang, his life was about to change forever. Through the supernatural static and the entity's presence, one call somehow broke through. The studio phone rang with a clear, pure tone that cut through the darkness like sunlight. Ryan, barely conscious, somehow found the strength to answer. "Hello, son." The voice was different from anything Ryan had heard before. Warm, patient, filled with a kindness that seemed to push back against the cold in the studio. It was an elderly man's voice, weathered by years but strong with conviction. Who? Who is this? Ryan gasped. Someone who knows what you're facing, the voice said gently. And there was something about it that reminded Ryan of his grandfather, who used to tell him stories about courage in the darkness. Someone who's seen these shadows before. You're not as alone as that thing wants you to believe, son. The creature hissed and recoiled slightly, as if the voice on the phone was causing it physical pain. Steam rose from its smoky form where the Guardian's words touched it. Listen to me carefully, Ryan. Fear feeds this entity. Despair makes it stronger. Guilt gives it power over you. But there's something more powerful than all of those things combined. The love of people who see your worth even when you can't see it yourself. As the elderly man spoke, Ryan felt something shift in the air around him. The oppressive weight that had been crushing his chest began to lift, just slightly. I don't understand, Ryan whispered, watching as the entity writhed and shrieked at the edges of his vision. Your pain reached them tonight, the Guardian explained patiently. When you cried out in fear, it wasn't just fear they heard. They heard someone fighting, someone refusing to give up even when everything seemed lost. That's not the sound of failure, son. That's the sound of courage. And courage is something this demon has never understood. Ama asıl şok edici olan şey, as the elderly man spoke, Ryan could see lights beginning to flicker on across Austin. Through the studio windows, he watched as people in their homes, in their cars, in their workplaces, began to bow their heads. Some held crosses, others simply folded their hands. Some whispered in English, others in Spanish, still others in languages Ryan didn't recognize. They were praying for him. How? Ryan whispered. Your fear reached them, the Guardian explained. But so did your pain. They recognize it because they felt it too. Every person listening right now has been where you are, scared, alone, convinced they're not enough. But here's what that thing doesn't want you to know. Failure isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning of your strength. The creature writhed and shrieked as more people across the city joined in prayer. Its smoky form began to waver and fade. I don't understand, Ryan said. But even as he spoke, he could feel something changing. The crushing weight of his failures didn't disappear, but it felt different, shared, bearable. You chose to come back to work not because you're weak, but because someone depends on you, the Guardian continued. You chose to face your fears instead of running. That's not failure, son. That's courage. And courage is something demons can't touch. Just when they thought it was over, the creature made one final, desperate attempt. It lunged forward with a sound like rending metal, trying to envelop Ryan in its smoky embrace. As it moved, Ryan could see faces in the smoke, twisted, agonized expressions of everyone he thought he'd failed. Mrs. Patterson was there, and his mother, and patients he'd never even treated, but imagined he should have saved. You belong with us, the entity shrieked as it reached for him. You belong with the failures, with the broken, with those who weren't strong enough. But as its smoky tendrils touched Ryan's skin, they met something solid, warm, protective. The prayers of hundreds of people surrounded him like armor made of light. He could feel each individual voice, the nurse in East Austin praying for his healing, the truck driver on I-35 asking God to protect him, the grandmother in her kitchen lighting a candle and whispering ancient words of protection. I am not my failures, Ryan said, his voice growing stronger with each word, powered by something greater than himself. I am not my mistakes. I am not defined by what I couldn't do. but by what I choose to do now. And right now, I choose to fight. The entity began to dissolve, its form unraveling like smoke in a hurricane. "This isn't over," it screamed as it faded, its voice growing thin and distant. "I'll find you again. I always come back." "No." The Guardian's voice came through the phone, calm and certain as sunrise. "You won't." This young man knows who he is now. He knows he's loved. He knows he has purpose. And he knows he's not alone. That's something you can never take from him because that's something you can never understand. The last wisps of smoke vanished like morning mist, and the studio was filled with warmth and light once again. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Amanda Torres burst into the studio, followed by several other station employees. They'd been listening from their cars in the parking lot, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. "Ryan!" Amanda rushed to his side. "Are you okay?" We felt like we needed to be here." Ryan looked around the studio. Everything was back to normal. Warm, well-lit, safe. The only sign of what had happened was the lingering smell of smoke, and the fact that every phone line was still blinking with incoming calls. "I need to thank them," Ryan said, gesturing to the phones. He went back on the air, his voice steady for the first time in years. "Austin, this is Ryan Mitchell. I don't know how to thank you for what just happened. I was in a dark place, and somehow you all found me there. You reminded me that we're all fighting our own battles, but we don't have to fight them alone." The calls came in one after another, not from demons this time, but from real people, with real voices sharing their own struggles and victories. A nurse who'd made it through medical school on her third try. A teacher who'd failed his first classroom but became beloved by his students. A mother who'd fought cancer and won. Ryan stayed on the air until 8 a.m., taking call after call, realizing for the first time that his show had always had an audience. He'd just been too afraid to hear them. Everyone had learned the truth. But the real shock was still waiting. 3 weeks later, Ryan was called into Mr. Hoffman's office. "Mitchell, have a seat," Hoffman said, but he was smiling. "That night, 3 weeks ago, whatever happened, it's made you a different broadcaster. Our ratings have tripled. People are calling the station, asking specifically for you." Ryan shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't told anyone the full truth about that night. Who would believe him? "We're moving you to the afternoon drive time slot," Hoffman continued. "Prime time, Mitchell. 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Better pay, better benefits, better everything. Congratulations." Ryan stared. Drive time was the most prestigious slot at the station. He'd dreamed of it for years, but never thought he was good enough. "I don't understand." "Why now?" "Because you found your voice," Hoffman said simply. "Whatever happened that night, you connected with people in a way that's rare in this business. Don't question it. Embrace it." That evening, Ryan sat in his new time slot booth, still barely believing the change in his life. His mother's medical bills were now manageable with his increased salary. More importantly, their relationship had healed. She'd listened to his late-night broadcast and finally understood the pain he'd been carrying. But one question still haunted him. As the sun set over Austin, Ryan picked up the phone and called Amanda, who was just finishing her day shift, in the main booth. "Amanda, can you do me a favor? Can you check the call logs from 3 weeks ago? From my show?" "Sure. Hold on." He heard her typing. "What time specifically?" "Right around the time everything went crazy. There should have been a call that lasted about 10 minutes. An elderly man's voice. More typing, then silence." "Ryan, that's impossible." "What do you mean?" "I'm looking at the logs." During that entire hour, there's no record of any incoming calls. The phone system shows it was completely dead, no signals in or out. But that can't be right because I heard you talking to someone. Ryan felt that familiar chill run down his spine. But this time it wasn't fear. It was wonder. The voice on the phone was familiar but impossible to trace because it had never used their equipment at all. Somewhere in the city, an elderly man in a worn coat and wide-brimmed hat smiled as he walked down a quiet street. His work here was done, but there were others out there in the darkness, others who needed to know they weren't alone. The radio waves carried on through the Austin night, connecting voices across the void, reminding everyone listening that failure wasn't the end of their stories. It was just the beginning of their strength. And in the KAUT 101.7 studio, Ryan Mitchell continued to broadcast hope into the darkness, never knowing that his guardian had been watching over him long before that terrifying night, and would continue to watch over others who needed to find their voice in the dark. The phone line stayed busy until dawn,